use, for which he won a Presidential Award. He's also the president of the Jewish Journal here in LA. So please welcome David Suissa to give his take.
You're probably wondering, how is it that you can want something so bad and still not get it? Chaim spoke about the clock, that you have to keep winding it. What would happen if winding has nothing to do with the problem? That there's a mechanism inside the clock that's faulty. And the more you wind, the less chance you have at a solution. There's an American way of life that says, the more you push for something, the more you get it. So we assume with the Middle East peace process and the partition, that the more we push for it, the more we'll get it. And why is it that the more we have pushed for it, the less we've gotten it? Imagine a building where we're all debating, what do we do with the second floor? Where do we put the conference room? Where do we put the bathroom? Meanwhile, the foundation is built out of hummus, or if you prefer, oatmeal. The foundation is completely shaky. And we've been spending most of our time debating the layout of the second floor. And the reason is, it's a question of mindset. And the mindset has been wrong from the very beginning. Peace is not a goal. Peace is a result. If they had renamed it the educational process 30 years ago, before Oslo, this was education. We are going to teach peace to both sides. Forget about the actual peace itself. Focus only on education. If Oslo had been an educational process rather than a peace process, we would be in a very different situation today. And I was saying this at the time of Oslo. And you know what they kept telling me? We have no time. We have no time for education. You know what, at a Hillel party, Chaim sat me next to Dennis Ross. And I was grateful for that, by the way, just before Dennis Ross book came out. And by the way, if you had to pick one person in the whole world, and Chaim will support me on this, who is more intimately aware of the peace process, it would be Dennis Ross, who's done it over several administrations. He was at Camp David. He's as knowledgeable as it gets. And I said, Dennis, do you have any regrets? Because he was in there at hundreds of meetings with Arafat, with presidents, with Palestinians, with Israelis, you name it, he was there. I said, do you have any regrets? He said, I have one major regret. I said, what is it? He said, we didn't enforce the anti-incitement clauses in the agreement that I negotiated. Anti-incitement is the teaching of hatred in the Palestinian schools. I have a book in my house of 300 pages from an organization called Palestinian Media Watch, and it documents the teaching of Jew hatred in Palestinian media, school, and mosque, and summer camps only for the past 12 months. And it's 300 pages. And Dennis Ross' admission to me was that I wish we would have enforced the anti-incitement clause, because that teaching of Jew hatred is the hummus in the foundation. It's the reason the building can never go up. It's the reason our meetings on the second meeting of how do we design the second and third floor, it's the reason that those meetings are useless. 30 years ago, you go to any Israeli, the thought of a Palestinian state was anathema. You would think maybe 5 to 10% of Israelis would agree to a Palestinian state. But over the years and decades, and believe me, I'm not a blind Israel supporter. I think Israel makes a ton of mistakes. And the last thing I want you to think is that I think Israel's all right and Palestine's all wrong. But I just want to look at the facts. And Chaim and Arieh will support me to say that a few decades ago, the idea of a Palestinian state was not acceptable to most Israelis. But over the years and the years and the years, in sort of some form of education, even if it wasn't formal, maybe it's the fact that we have a free press, maybe it's the fact that we allow demonstrations, we had 150,000 peaceniks demonstrating in Israel for years and years and years, maybe that got through. That got through. And eventually, even some of my friends on the right saying, we have to have peace. And when Oslo came, we said, whoa, maybe this can happen. So that process happened to a large extent in Israel, but unfortunately it wasn't happening on the other side. I'm an Arab Jew. So my ancestors lived with Arabs for centuries. I have no problem with Arabs. In fact, we have the same father, Abraham. I think the idea that we are seen as the enemy in the Middle East is completely outrageous. But it's a fact that for dictators to stay in power, they had to create a common enemy. And the Jews were the perfect common enemy. The Jews were the perfect scapegoat to divert attention away from the fact that millions of women are oppressed, millions of gays are oppressed, the fact that millions of people live in total utter oppression that has nothing to do with Israel. 99% of the problems, 100% of the problems in the rest of the Middle East have nothing to do with the Palestinian conflict. But somehow this narrative was created that Israel's presence is responsible for most of the ills in the Middle East. And what was that narrative based on? It was a narrative, by the way, that makes a lot of sense if you don't know any better. It was a narrative that says that the Arabs of the Middle East were punished for the sins of the Nazis. The Arabs had nothing to do with the fact that 6 million Jews went into were murdered in the Holocaust. But the narrative that they were taught is that Israel came out of the Holocaust, which means that the Jews have no connection. The fact that we have a 3,000-year connection to Jerusalem is completely ignored. Our peace partner 2 months ago in Doha, our peace partner Mahmoud Abbas, denied any connection, any Jewish connection to Jerusalem. So this is the false narrative that was taught. So when I say this should be called an educational peace process, I mean it. So if you teach the Arabs that the Jews have a connection that goes way beyond the Holocaust, that goes into the thousands of years, that there's a continuous Jewish presence, if you teach about the League of Nations, if you teach about San Remo and the rights that were given by international law, by the League of Nations, that the Jews were allowed to populate Palestine, if you teach that Palestinians were Jews, the Jerusalem Post was called the Palestinian Post. If you look at posters at the turn of the century that were encouraging people to come, Jews to come to Israel, it was come to Palestine. If you teach that before Israel took over the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, you never heard about a Palestinian state. From 1948 to 1967, no one ever heard about a movement of a Palestinian state. But when Israel took over the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, then all of a sudden, the Palestinian state idea came up. But when the PLO was formed in 1964, it was not about the creation of a Palestinian state. It was about the destruction of the Zionist entity. Now look at this. If I steal your car, do you owe me anything? And I'm saying, well, you got to come negotiate. Why should you come negotiate with me? I've stolen your car. So if we reinforce the narrative that Judea and Samaria are stolen land, that this is an illegal occupation, that the Jews, Israel, stole this land, then what incentive is there for the Palestinians to negotiate? All we need to do then is give it back. So when you ask yourself, why is it that we can never have peace? Boom, boom, boom. Or like Chaim says, we keep pushing, we keep winding the clock, and we keep searching and pushing for peace. Why is it? Because the underlying foundation is rotten. And part of that underlying foundation is the mindset that the Jews have stolen land. And I think if you love peace and you love a two-state solution, Israel should make its legitimate claim for Judea and Samaria and say, we don't believe this is stolen land. We believe we, the Jews and Israel, have a legitimate claim to the West Bank. However, we're willing to give it up for the sake of peace, which is very different than saying, all right, we stole it, we'll give it back to you, but we can't give you back all of it. We're willing to give it up, not give it back, to give it up for the sake of peace. That's a whole different mindset, and that's how you begin to change the foundation.